Why are women so hard on themselves, and how do they stop? Welcome to the Self-Authority Podcast. I'm your host, Elaine Belson, the Self-Authority Coach. Today, it's just you and me, and I'm going to be sharing a story about being hard on yourself and how I learned to stop. So I call this my Bed Bath & Beyond moment because I was coming out of the store, Bed Bath & Beyond, and I immediately felt that rush of anxiety that was so familiar, oftentimes when I would walk away from just having a conversation. And so I immediately felt compelled to rehash the conversation that I had just had at the register. Now, of course, I don't remember what that conversation was, but you can relate to that, right? How many times have we worried about something and then a couple of days later we forgot what it was we were even worried about? Or we say to ourselves, what I was worried about was worse than the actual reality, right? So I thought to myself, what am I doing? And I realized that I felt compelled to rehash this conversation, that I felt compelled to monitor myself. And it reminded me of alcohol because I thought to myself, this feels like almost like an addiction. And then I thought to myself, well, what do alcoholics do when they're trying to stop drinking? They avoid having alcohol around. And so I thought about that and I thought, I'm going to do the same thing with being hard on myself. And I decided that moment that I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive away, and I'm never looking back. And from that moment on, that's what I did. Anytime I caught myself being hard on myself, I would stop and I would say to myself, I'm not going to go there. I'm not even going to allow myself to think about it. And I realized that that is easier said than done. And in fact, I call it walking a tightrope without a net because that's how scary it can feel to give up that bully in your head. I realized that being hard on myself was something I was doing to protect myself. And what was I trying to protect myself from was rejection and failure. In fact, I will often ask my clients, what do you think it would feel like to stop being hard on yourself? And they would go, oh, that would feel great. And then I'll say, well, then why aren't you doing it? The reason why is because they're trying to prevent rejection and failure. And they think that they have to be hard on themselves in order to do it. So that was really important revelation, number one. Number two, I realized that I was afraid to be myself, that I didn't trust myself, that I was good enough the way that I am, and that I was struggling with feelings of inadequacy. That is, I'm not good enough, I'm undeserving, or there's something inherently wrong with me. Now, I have come to the conclusion that everyone fears rejection and failure at some point. I believe that those are innate because we are hardwired to crave connection with other people because that helps us to survive. And so that's fear of rejection. And then fear of failure is what motivates us to thrive. So fear of rejection and failure are, I believe, survival mechanisms. And then the feelings of inadequacy, I think, are also normal. I think that we all feel that way when we get outside our comfort zone, but that can be compounded by upbringing and how we were made to feel about ourselves. So feelings of inadequacy, I'm not good enough. There's something inherently wrong with me, or I'm undeserving. And then fears of rejection and failure. So if you feel inadequate and you're afraid of rejection and failure, what are you going to do? You're going to bend over backwards. You're going to overcompensate. And that's what I was doing. So I was rehashing conversations, mind reading, anticipating other people's reactions, comparing myself to others, overanalyzing, and self-criticizing. Now, the interesting thing is that if I were talking to somebody else, I would never say to them, if you want to avoid rejection and failure, here's what you need to do. You need to mind read, second guess yourself, anticipate other people's reactions, compare yourself to others, overanalyze, and self-criticize. Right? Sounds pretty ridiculous. But yet that's what women do to themselves, because they tell themselves that I'm not good enough the way that I am. I'm undeserving. There's something inherently wrong with me. And so I have to bend over backwards, overcompensate to avoid rejection and failure. And I learned that I was afraid to trust myself, that I was good enough the way that I am, that I was deserving of acceptance and appreciation, and that just because I failed doesn't mean that I am a failure. So interestingly enough, what I found was that as I continued to resist the temptation to be hard on myself, my confidence shot up and it became easier and easier to do it. And I began to trust myself that I was good enough the way that I was. Not perfect, but deserving, good enough, and that there wasn't something inherently wrong with me. So what do you do instead? Well, think about it. What do we say to other people? We tell them, just be yourself. Don't worry about what other people think, right? And when someone else makes a mistake, we don't talk to them the way we talk to ourselves. And the reason for that is because when we're talking to other people, it's from a place of reason and values. This is what makes sense. If I'm going to try to help somebody, then I'm going to talk to them in a constructive, positive way. And values. This is the way I treat people. But when we're talking to ourselves, it's from a place of fear and insecurity. So what I teach is how to self-validate. This is one of the core concepts of self-authority, is learning how to self-validate. The good news is that you already know how to self-validate because you do it for other people all the time, right? What are we always telling other people? You're good enough the way that you are. Don't worry about what other people think. Right? Everybody makes mistakes. And so that's what you're going to do for yourself. Anytime you catch yourself being hard on yourself, talking to yourself negatively, what you're going to do is you're going to ask yourself, would I talk to somebody that I care about the way that I'm talking to myself? And if the answer is no, Then ask yourself, how would I talk to somebody else? Because if you wouldn't talk to somebody else that way, you certainly shouldn't be talking to yourself that way. So let's break this down. Let's say that I accidentally double booked 2 clients. And once I realized it, I say to myself, that was really stupid. That was irresponsible. I should have known better. I should have been more careful. So then I imagine saying that to somebody else, and a colleague who says, oh, I accidentally double booked 2 clients. Wow, well, that was stupid and irresponsible, and you should be ashamed of yourself. It was unprofessional. Would we say that? No, I wouldn't. What would I say instead? I would say, okay, happens to everybody, but what can you learn from it? What can you do differently to prevent that from happening in the future? In other words, you problem solve. And what I would ask my clients, why wouldn't you talk to other people the way you talk to yourself? They would say, because it's mean. Oh, okay. And it's not really helpful because you're not solving anything. If you want to learn from a mistake, you don't beat yourself up. You look at, what can I learn from this? What was I thinking at the time? What was I feeling? What was going on for me that day, that week, that month, that year? What about my background, my history might have contributed to me handling the situation the way that I did? Those are the things that we need to ask ourselves when we make mistakes. I call it being Columbo without the trench coat and cigar. Some of you may know the detective from the 1970s show Columbo, and he was always walking around with a trench coat and cigar in his hand and asking a lot of questions. That's what we need to do, right, when we make mistakes. So again, you're going to ask yourself, would I talk to somebody else the way I'm talking to myself? And if the answer is no, what would I say to them instead? Because that's what I should be saying to myself. And why this works is because when we talk to other people, we talk from a place of reason, what makes sense, and values. This is how you treat people. And when we talk to ourselves, it's from a place of fear and insecurity. So we are accessing different parts of the brain, and that's why that works. The second self-validation technique is anytime somebody else is making you feel bad about yourself, not you being hard on yourself, but somebody else is making you feel bad about yourself. Then what you want to do is you want to practice what I call the opposite of the golden rule. So you know what the golden rule is. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. The opposite of the golden rule is you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. Anytime somebody makes you feel bad about yourself, ask yourself, if the situation reversed, would I be treating this person the way they're treating me? Would I be talking to them the way they're talking to me? And if the answer is no, well, then that tells you something. It tells you what their values are versus your values. And that this has nothing to do with you, because this is the way you treat people, regardless of who it is. So what you're identifying is the way you treat people versus the way this other person treats people. And you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. So that is the opposite of the golden rules. So what you're doing is you are learning how to rely on yourself for a sense of self rather than using other people as mirrors for a sense of self. So what do I mean by that? Well, growing up, one of the roles of a parent is to be what we call a mirror, or mirroring object, actually, is the term, for their children. So how a child gets a sense of self depends a lot on how their parents react to them, their tone of voice, the words that they use, their body language. So imagine a little girl comes running home and she says, "Mommy, I fell off my bike." And mom says, "Well, you should be more careful next time." Not earth-shatteringly inappropriate, but compare that to, "That's okay. Everyone falls off their bike sometimes, and I know you're a good bike rider, and you'll get back on and you'll do great." So what are these two different moms reflecting back, mirroring back to their child? In the first case, the mom is reflecting back, "You've done something wrong. There's something wrong with you." In the second case, the mom is normalizing falling off the bike and sending the message that this child is competent and capable, and also teaching resilience. So as we get older, we start using other people as mirrors, not just our parents, but we start treating other people as mirrors for a sense of self. So the problem is, as we get into adulthood, and we're still using people as mirrors, adults can be unreliable mirrors, or as I like to call them, carnival mirrors. You know, when you go to a carnival and they have those warped mirrors that make you look really tall and really short. So you have to think of people like carnival mirrors. Why? Because two reasons. Because we live in a society where we don't talk about feelings, and most don't learn emotional intelligence. They don't learn how to cope with their feelings or express them very well. And so when you rely on other people as mirrors, what you're really relying on, in most cases, is a dysfunctional way of coping with an emotion. Or we also don't talk about communication and constructive ways of communicating. And so when you rely on other people as mirrors, you could be relying on dysfunctional communication skills. Now, this can happen even under the best of circumstances, and I'll give you an example. So my daughter, when she was still in college, had a tendency to be asleep when I would come to pick her up. And then I would have to actually go into the dorm room, go to the front desk, ask somebody to go up to her dorm room and pound on her door to wake her up. And then we would talk about it, and she would promise me the next time she wouldn't do it. And guess what? She did this 3 times in a row. And so after the third time, I was pretty angry. I was fed up. And when I got her on the phone, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "Emily, what is wrong with you?" Now, there's nothing wrong with my daughter. She's actually a very bright, caring, witty person. It was her behavior that was the problem, not her as a person. And I realized immediately that I was wrong, and I apologized. And then I just explained that I was frustrated. So what was I mirroring back to my daughter? That there was something wrong with her, as opposed to a behavior that needed to be worked on. And on the way home, we talked about it some more and figured out why she kept doing that and what she could do instead. That's how we solve problems, right? When then there's a mistake, we learn from it. So we don't want to use people as mirrors, because people can be carnival mirrors. Now, I'm not talking about constructive feedback like you might get at your job, or if you ask a close friend to give you feedback. I'm talking about people's reactions when we base our sense of self, who we are, our worth, our competence on how other people react. Because most of the time, people don't express themselves in terms of feelings. They don't say, I was frustrated. They say, what is wrong with you? They don't communicate. When you didn't answer my phone calls and I had to go to the front desk and ask them to wake you up, I felt frustrated. So we need to learn emotional intelligence and constructive communication, but it's not something that our society really encourages or teaches. So what we're talking about is relying on yourself for a sense of self instead of treating other people like mirrors for a sense of self. This is also about trusting yourself that you're good enough the way that you are. Again, not perfect, but that's okay because nobody's perfect, right? And when you don't do that, when you don't trust yourself, you reinforce that you're not a person that can just be yourself, that you have to be hard on yourself in order to avoid rejection and failure. You need to take that leap of faith. You need to, what I call like walking the tightrope without a net. And it feels scary at first to give up that inner bully that you think is protecting you from rejection and failure, but there's a better way of avoiding rejection and failure. And that is through emotional intelligence. So anytime you're being hard on yourself, just understand that you're trying to cope with fear of rejection and failure, and that's normal. But the way to cope with it is to ask yourself, what specifically am I afraid is going to happen? And then what's in my control to prevent it? So let's say that you have to give a presentation and you immediately start being hard on yourself and saying, I'm going to screw this up. People are going to think I'm unprofessional. Everyone's going to think that I don't know what I'm talking about. You can stop and say, okay, what specifically am I afraid is going to happen? Am I afraid that I'm going to lose my train of thought? Or am I afraid that people are going to be bored and start looking at their phones? Am I afraid that people are going to ask questions that I'm not going to know the answers to? Whatever it is, there is a solution. And so rather than beating yourself up, you can go to, what is it specifically that I'm afraid is going to happen? And what's in my control to prevent myself from losing my train of thought, or people being bored, or me not being prepared to answer people's questions? In the case of losing my train of thought, I can practice. Practice, practice, practice. I can have note cards. I can look at my slides. I can take a deep breath, take a drink of water, take a pause, give my brain a chance to catch up. If I'm afraid that people will be bored, well, what can I do to make the talk more interesting? I can tell stories or jokes, involve the audience, ask questions of the audience. What if I'm afraid that they'll ask questions I don't have the answers to? Well, I can start thinking about what kinds of questions they may have, anticipate some of those questions. And then if it's a question that I don't know the answer to, I can say, that's a really good question. I will get back to you on that. I will send you an email. with the answer. So that's how you prevent rejection and failure, is by identifying what it is that you're afraid will happen, and then what's in your control to prevent it. Now, there are some things that aren't in our control, namely what other people think and how other people manage their emotions. You're not responsible for other people's perceptions and the way other people manage their emotions. All you can do is be yourself and try your best, but forgive yourself for being human and hold others accountable for being more understanding, tolerant of other people's mistakes or other people's imperfections or differences, and hold other people accountable for if something is bothering them, that they come to you and they tell you, not in a reactionary way. That means they have to manage their feelings and they have to communicate constructively. So, what we talked about is why women are hard on themselves. They're hard on themselves to protect themselves from rejection and failure, that they're afraid of just being themselves, even though if they were talking to somebody else, they would never tell them, if you want to avoid rejection and failure, you have to be hard on yourself. That we all experience feelings of inadequacy. I'm not good enough. I'm undeserving. There's something inherently wrong with me, especially when we get outside our comfort zone. But that may be compounded by upbringing. But if we trust ourselves, if we resist the temptation to be hard on ourselves, it will get easier. Our confidence will go up. And I have a theory about this, that we start with feelings of inadequacy, and then we fear rejection and failure. And because we feel inadequate, we cope with that fear of rejection and failure by being hard on ourselves. But being hard on ourselves also creates feelings of inadequacy. So it becomes a vicious cycle. So what do you do instead? We talked about self-validating instead of using other people as mirrors. This is a foundation of self-authority, relying on yourself for a sense of self. You can do that in two ways: by being your own best friend and practicing the opposite of the golden rule, and by trusting yourself. Even though it might feel scary at first to let go of being hard on yourself, you know that reason and values, it doesn't make sense to cope with fear, rejection, failure by being hard on yourself. That it makes more sense to problem solve. What can I learn from this? So trust yourself that you are good enough the way that you are, that there's nothing inherently wrong with you, and that you deserve to be treated the way you treat other people. And lastly, to hold others accountable for how they manage their emotions and how they communicate. So thank you for listening to the Self Authority Podcast. If this talk resonated with you, please share it with other people that you think would benefit. And remember to like and subscribe so that you get future notifications of when the podcast comes out. If you want to learn more about me, or you would like to set up a 15-minute discovery call, you can go to theselfauthoritycoach.com. And I look forward to talking with you next time. Take care.